Although I have to say, the tone adopted by my old guide is a bit obsequious, in fact, a bit grovelling. For example, it says here, the castle is reached through the grounds, which by the liberality of the noble proprietor are open to the public.
But not all visitors were overawed by the ducal pile. In 1787, the poet Robert Burns visited the town and wrote pointedly about the social divisions he found here. Whoe'er he be who sojourns here, I pity much his case, unless he's come to wait upon the Lord their God, his grace.
A few years later, the poet William Wordsworth and his sister Dorothy visited the town on their Highland tour, and they too saw the contrast between the wealth of the Duke and his castle and the poverty in the streets.
We passed through the town, which is a doleful example of Scotch filth, a melancholy spectacle giving the notion of either vice or extreme wretchedness. Happily, there's no sign of Scotch filth on the windy streets of Inverary today, which seems spotlessly clean and peopled exclusively by the virtuous. But to find out more about the gulf between vice and virtue, rich and poor, I've come to another of Inverary's popular tourist attractions, the jail. I'm met by the formidable figure of Hannah Nixon.
Hello, Hannah.
Good afternoon.
Lovely to meet you.
In her role as prison matron, it's Hannah's job to educate and entertain modern tourists on visits to this once grim penal institution.
This is the old prison. I'll take you to a cell which shows you how it really was in the early days. You're talking about 1820 when we first opened. You would have had 3-4 prisoners in every cell originally. You can see here, this is...
In this small space?
In this small space. You know, sleeping on the floor, men, women, children, criminally insane all together in the prison. You've got a good example here of a prisoner that was in 1820. He's obviously a prisoner with a sense of humour. He's written on the wall there, a room to let to the 26th day of June, application to be made to Duncan Campbell, jailer. Hugh Curry is off forever. So if you're wanting a cell to live in, he's off. You can have this one if you make the application.
Role play at Inverary is part of the modern tourist experience. Not only is there a prison matron, I'm about to meet one of the inmates too.
Another cell and a prisoner.
A prisoner, this is Elizabeth. This is a good example of the reforms of Scotland kicking in now, 1841, and the cleanliness that the prisoners would have to endure, really.
She doesn't look very happy.
Well, unfortunately, she had lice. She wouldn't wash properly, so we have had to go to drastic measures. I hope you've not got a weak stomach, sir.
I have a slightly weak
Do
stomach.
you? Elizabeth? Take your bonnet off, please. We have had to shave her head. If you don't wash properly, this is what will happen to you. It's to teach you a lesson. You all right? Behaving yourself?
Yes.
She's in for theft.
She's in for theft. So what did you steal?
I stole 2 silver jugs from a hotel in Dunadd where I was working.
Right. And how long did you get?
I got 2.5 years, sir.
2.5 years. So that's 1 year and 3 months per jug.
Is it, sir?
Yeah. Do you think that was worth it?
It was at the time, sir.
Despite prison reforms, crime was still harshly punished in Victorian times.
So this is a good example of the punishment set with the reforms of Scotland. This is the whipping table.
A whipping table?
If you disobey our rules here, you will be beaten. Now, it is just for the males, boys as well. Children as young as 7 would come to this prison. If you disobey our rules, a child may well be beaten.
And beaten with this?
Yes, that's the birch.
So how did this contraption work?
Well, the best way is to demonstrate it, Sarah. If I take that and you'd like to lie up there.
Okay, it looks quite innocuous
on your stomach.
It's a bit like I don't know, a massage table or something.
It won't feel like a massage, Sarah.
Want to put my arms through here?
Straight through.
Okay.
At Inverary Jail, visitors are encouraged to sample even the grimmest aspects of prison life. The experience can sometimes take quite a beating.
Oh, wait! That was painful. That was painful. Slightly risible, but I suppose what I find curious is why people on holiday want to come to a prison. Is there a kind of misery tourism going on here, do you
There
think?
is really. People have always been interested in what we would nowadays call the macabre, anything to do with death, torture, damnation. People like to come, have a go, see what it was like, try all the different things that we have here. Today, yes, it is very humorous for them, but it does give them an idea of what went on in the past.
As matron leads me back through the prison to freedom, she tells me that in Victorian times, people would go on holiday and visit prisons like this. It's amusing to think that a century later, modern tourists are still doing the same thing. Back on the streets of Inverary, it looks as if we're in for a spot of rain. Before I catch the worst of the weather, it's time to move on and over the hills to my next destination, Loch Awe. Loch Awe is the longest freshwater loch in Scotland and is, without question, an absolute treasure, whatever the weather.
Black's is fulsome in its praises, describing the loch as a glittering jewel with green bowered islands nestling on the bosom of the lake. Not today, it isn't.
Come rain or shine, the Victorians were quick to see the tourist potential of lovely Loch Awe. And at one time, as many as 15 steamers sailed among the wooded islands. But of course, progress has meant that these elegant little ships suffered the same fate as nearly all the other steamers on Scotland's lochs. They were scrapped years ago.
The steamer may have gone, but the landscape is just as spectacular and wild as it was when Victorian tourists were told enthralling legends about the landscape as they sailed amongst the islands of the loch.
Hearing these romantic tales, told to them by their kilted Highland guides in this wonderful setting, made Victorian tourists feel close to the true spirit of Scotland. Here, every island, every inlet and bay has a tale of its own, part of a tradition that connects Loch Awe to an epic past. As I make my way down the loch, I'm passing through 2,000 years of history, heading for the cradle of the nation. This is Kilmartin Glen. I've always thought that this part of Argyll has a magic of its own. There's something about the quality of light here, the distant views to the islands, the long sea lochs and the roughly wooded hillsides that's particularly atmospheric. It's also a place with a special significance in the history of the Scottish nation. Kilmartin Glen has one of the most important concentrations of Neolithic and Bronze Age remains in Scotland. Within just a few miles, there are over 350 ancient monuments, making this a unique ceremonial landscape that was once sacred to our ancestors.
For 3,000 years, this tiny, damp corner of Scotland was an important centre for different people and different cultures, from the Stone Age right up to the early Christian period when the country we now call Scotland was coming into being. And the most striking and significant of all the ancient monuments associated with this story can be found right here at Dunadd.
Now, it might not look much, but this small rocky hill is where the story of the nation really begins. This is the cradle of Scotland. 1,600 years ago, a fort stood at the top of this hill. Over the years, it's become a place of pilgrimage for tourists. And it was up here, on a sacred stone, that the kings of Riata were invested with their royal powers.
Now this is where it's all said to have taken place. Over here is a stone footprint cut into the rock. Now according to archaeologists, this is where the king-to-be would have placed his own foot in a ritual act that symbolised the union of the human world with the divine. Now I'm not the first person to have noticed that this kingly footprint is a bit, well, diminutive. Now I'd say that was probably a size 3.
You can get a sense of why Dunadd was so important to the ancient world from the summit. It lies at the centre of a landscape that has an almost mystical atmosphere. Up here you get a powerful feeling of being in touch with the distant past, which is why, for me, this could be the spiritual heart of Scotland. But there is another contender for the title of spiritual heart, and to get there, I have to sail to the islands. On the next leg of my journey, I'm crossing the sea to Islay, the spiritual home of whisky. But this is no scheduled ferry service. To retrace the old steamer routes that once crossed the west coast, I've joined Sandy Campbell aboard the modern motor cruiser Venture West.
Sandy, what kind of business do you run then?
Hey, well, just a charter boat business. Take people where they want to be, along with some wildlife trips and Corrie wrecking trips to the whirlpool. And there's usually it's quite a good kind of area for wildlife. There's some seagulls that nest in the north end there, along with there's a lot of seals and porpoise. Sometimes have dolphin. Later on in the year we have some basking shark and a minke whale around. So yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah.
Sandy's high-tech rib is a far cry from the steamers that carried the few early tourists who ventured this far off the beaten track. As Black's notes, the traffic of the Westward Isles is maintained by steamers of the smaller class, the natives herding on the foredeck, Gaelic their dialect, and teetotalism a creed little believed in.
Now, I think it's odd that my guide should make such a sneering reference to the pleasures that ordinary folk could derive from alcohol, because in the very next sentence, the same writer goes on to praise Islay for the quality of its whisky. Now, I think what he's trying to imply here is that it's okay for wealthy tourists to enjoy the water of life, but for ordinary people, it's degrading. Wealthy people could be connoisseurs. The poor just got drunk.
As I consider the mixed morals of Victorian tourists, I enjoy a large glass of whisky. I count myself lucky that I'm a connoisseur and not a lush. Anyone arriving in Islay today can't fail to notice the continuing importance of whisky. Famous names greet you at every turn. Lagavulin, Lafroig, Beaumont, villages celebrated the world over because of the whisky that comes